Hello everyone. Next review, two in a row. The Dark Domain by Stefan Grabinski. Fairly evocative cover. This is a really quite good book. It's the last book I read. I just finished it today. So I was going to review George MacDonald. That'll be coming next. Just read the back of this just to give you an idea. This is an interesting blurb by China Mayville or Myville from The Guardian, in The Guardian. Really quite good blurb here. Reading The Dark Domain is such a revelatory experience because here's a writer for whom supernatural horrors manifest precisely in modernity, in electricity, fire stations, trains. The uncanny is the bad conscience of today. Sometimes Grabinski is known as the Polish Poe, but this is misleading. Where Poe's horror is agonized, a kind of extended shriek, Grabinski's is cerebral, investigative. His protagonists are tortured and aghast, but not because they suffer at the caprice of Lovecraftian blind idiot gods. Grabinski's universe is strange, and its principles are perhaps not what we expect, but they are principles, rules, and it is in their exploration that the mystery lies. This is horror as rigour. Quite a good blurb, I think. And this is a writer who was writing in the early 1900s, suffered from tuberculosis. He was fairly gloomy and introspective, and that pretty much covers all of the protagonists in this book. He's very interested in esotericism, mysticism, the metaphysical nature of reality, constantly questioning things. I put this in the same category as Knut Hamsun, the Norwegian writer of Hunger and Pan and Dostoevsky and all those more solitary, individualistic writers. It's very modernist in a way. There's a few. Just before I get started, I'll mention that there's a couple of concepts here. So he was interested in this force called the Elan Vital. I believe that's how you pronounce it. This philosophical idea, first conceptualized by Bergson, I believe, about this creative force underlying everything, and that takes a few forms in some of these short stories. So he was a modernist and he believed in evolution, but he didn't view it in the correct way, which is sort of deterministic, mechanistic process, steps over time leading to complexity. He viewed it as this creative force in every organism and in every individual that gave rise to man and non-human animals, etc. So that's that really, and there's a few concepts here, but I won't dwell on them too much. So a big thing about this, if you're not interested in trains, I'm not particularly interested in trains, but I should say there's a few stories that deal with locomotives in this, in motion and speed. A few stories in here that deal with trains and their symbolism and their sort of allegorical nature and their philosophical ways in which trains and locomotives can be viewed, I suppose. There's doppelgangers in this book. There's mistaken identities, fluid identities. There's feels very modern. There's paranoia, etc., etc. Hermaphrodites. There's madness. I highly recommend reading the introduction to this book by the translator. Talks about the influences and whatnot. So Fumes is the first story. I didn't quite connect with this. It's about an engineer who comes into a tavern on the side of the road after a snowstorm. Quite evocative writing at the start. Very vital and driving. I'll read the first paragraph. A new herd of gusts advanced from the ravines and set loose over snow-covered fields. They ploughed their enraged head through the snowbanks. Raised from its soft bedding, the snow swirled in huge cyclones, bottomless funnels, slender whips, and wrapping itself up in a 100-folded, repeated whirlpool, sprayed out white granular powder. An early winter evening was coming on. Reminds me of Tolstoy's Master and Man, I think it is, sort of Eastern Russian snowy landscape. That's the only one that's really like that. So it's a good contrast, because once he gets into this tavern, this very claustrophobic, dusty, smoky tavern, it's all about heat and warmth, and it's contrasted quite well with the outside. there's not too much in this story. It's about hermaphrodites, really. It's about fluid identity. He meets a young woman. There's also the innkeeper, tavern keeper, and there's possibly this mixing of the two characters. I won't say much more than that. A lot of these stories are very introspective, and you can't really talk about them without just reading it. Very good sense of sort of his seclusion, though. I won't dwell on that story too much, though. It's interesting, but didn't really connect with me as much. A story that I did enjoy, though, was The Motion Demon. It's all about it's a first train story. For me, I found it really quite interesting. It's this character who is almost in a fugue-like state. He ends up on trains. He has this need to travel, but he doesn't really know how he gets on trains. He doesn't know his destination either. And I'll say there's an interesting idea of the sort of mechanistic or the human limitations. So this character, he's interested in train travel in he's interested in speed and motion, I should say. He has this idea of it's not connected, speed and motion is not connected with the human sense of speed and motion. He takes a cosmic view. The motion of the planets and whatnot, just constant, unrestricted speed and the way things could be, sort of speed of light type idea. And this is contrasted with the railway officer conductor, who is very much pragmatic, and he says, "Long live rail travel and this new mode of transport." He's proud of this new technology. Again, it's early days. And there's a funny bit, really. I'll just give an example of what I mean. It says, but most of all, Saigon, the main character, was irritated by railway advertisements and uniforms. How funny was the pathos of those travel allegories hanging about waiting rooms, how pretentious the sweeping gestures of those little geniuses of speed. Yet the most comical impression was created by those winged circles on the caps and lapels of the officials. What nerve, what fantasy, at the sight of these insignias. Saigon frequently had the urge to tear them off and replace them with a likeness of a dog chasing its own tail. So you can see there's that idea of human limitation and the presumption of man to dominate and strive, and but Saigon can see things differently. They're not really getting anywhere, no matter how fast they go. It's just all on Earth. They're just going round and round in circles. They can only go so far. Is what the point of the story really is. There's a strange part, though, where I'll say certain characters shrink. I'm not sure how that connects with. There's certain stories, it's a good point actually, there's certain stories where there's elements that feel disappointing. Maybe I'm just not smart enough to figure out how they connect, but certain characters shrink in the story, and I'm not sure how that connects with the element of speed and motion. The Area is a brilliant story. Really connected with me, actually. The Area. There's a character called Resmian, probably not how you pronounce it, a writer who is very much avant-garde. He writes things that aren't even surreal. They're so surreal that they don't have any connection to human understanding. And there's he very reclusive, and people think of him as fairly strange. He has this idea of wanting always to. He has actually, I should say, he disregards the writing method entirely. He disregards writing. He's finished being an author in the conventional sense. He has this idea of wanting his fantasies and his ideas to almost come to life in a way. He believes, again, it's this élan vital in another sense, where an idea can be so concrete and given so much passion that it comes to life. I think that's what he's trying to say here. It's in the story, it makes more sense than I'm probably saying it, but yeah. And so I think the conceit here is there's a brilliant part where I'll just say he creates this locus of ideas where it's a villa. It takes the form of a villa across the street from him, and there's just I'll read this passage here. This is a story that got me thinking, this is art. I actually frowned at how dreamlike this is. I felt like I was reading something special here. By odd chance, the place enveloped by the mind of the dreamer, and the one he transformed into the area of his dreams was not his home, his just apartment or whatever. The oasis of his fiction arose opposite his windows, on the other side of the street, in the form of a two-storied villa. The gloomy elegance of the house captivated him from the first moment he had occupied his new abode. At the end of a black double row of cypresses, their two lines containing a stone pathway, appeared a several-stepped terrace where a weighty, stylized double door led to the interior. Across the iron railing that surrounded the mansion, the wings of the house were losing colour. Sickly and sad walls coated with a pale greenish paint peered out from inside. From underneath the garden, treacherously concealed humidity crawled out here and there with dark oozing. That part there is sort of connects to later on. It might not make sense. And he goes on to talk about this melancholy villa. I got this idea of just the sad green walls, and there's a fountain, and it's this mournful cypresses, and essentially he populates this villa with his own creations, and they eventually come. They actually, he sees them through it with their sort of pale faces, sees them through the 100 or multiple windows of this villa from across the street. I had this very strange image. I'm sure when you read it you'll get the idea. I should say, actually, I want to highlight, I just found this. Thus, imperceptibly, some unreachable habitat was formed, some secret oasis to which no one had access except Resmian, king of this unseen world. This milieu, imbued with the ego of the dreamer, appeared to the uninitiated as a simple place in space. People could only perceive its exterior physical existence, but the internal pulsations of fermenting thoughts, the subtle connection these had with Resmian's own person, they failed to sense. King of this unseen world. Love stuff like that. So yes, I won't go. There's a very gripping end to this short story. The area. But moving on from that, hope that captured your attention there. Quite interesting story. There's a story called A Tale of the Gravedigger, which I won't go into. It's a fairly standard story. I didn't really enjoy it, and also I found that there was an odd contradiction. Something just didn't make sense, and it just felt a bit flat and disappointing in a way. Unfortunate. That's the case with short stories, though. Collections. Samoa's Mistress, a decent story. I'm going to skip a few ones like Samoa's Mistress that I didn't particularly enjoy. I found what I liked about these stories is the way that it delves into the characters' heads, but the way and how that sort of gradually develops over time. And that was good. It reminded me almost in a sense like a White Nights type feeling, which is a short story or novella by Dostoevsky. But I didn't really. I felt like some of these stories fell flat in a way. This one's considered quite good by most people, and the ending image is quite evocative for what it is. But it's just one of those stories that I didn't really connect with. It's a longer one. The Wandering Train, funnily enough, this is one that people didn't like, and I quite enjoyed it. It's just a fairly simple one. The Wandering Train, again, it's another train story. I just like this idea of, again, of course, if there's going to be a place that's mechanistic and has this constant need for timetables and logistics and keeping everything on track, there's this wandering train that comes along. And it's a very short, it's almost like a prose poem in a way. I feel like he could have done more, but there's a ghost train. It's not as stupid as it sounds, though. There's a ghost train where it disrupts the normal way of things, and I really quite enjoyed this. They're at a train station. It takes this sort of omniscient viewpoint where we don't really have characters. It's more of a overview feel. Perspective, and they're at this train station, and these people are aware that this wandering train exists in Poland, I suppose it is, but they're not sure where it's going to arrive, and everyone's sharing glances with each other, worried, staring glances, and it eventually does arrive. And I'll just say that there's I'm going to give spoilers for this. It's a quite sort of prose poem. This train almost collides with another, but it actually goes through the original train. It's on the same track, and something I found quite almost poignant in a way. So just read the end of this. Everyone is in a standing position, facing the direction of the vanished phantom locomotive. Some terrible force has bewitched these people, holding them in dumb amazement. Some strong current has polarized this assembly of souls to one side. Their outstretched hands indicate some unknown goal, an aim surely distant. Their inclined bodies lean to the distance, to a stunning misty land far away, and their eyes, glazed by a wild alarm and enchantment, are lost in boundless space. So they stand and are silent. No muscle will twitch, no eyelid will fall. So they stand and are silent. Goes on for a little bit more, but just for brevity's sake. I like this idea of just normality, everything's going according to plan, and then this, for a split second, it's like being taken out of, it's like if something serious happens or whatever, you're taken out of normality, and you're, I got the sense from the story that it's like looking out the grander view of things, I suppose. So there's a story called Strabismus, which I didn't really connect with. Apparently it's one of his better ones, but I really enjoyed the build-up to these stories. This is one that deals with individualism and identity, but the end made no sense. This character behind a wall in a sort of Poe-esque scenario, if you probably understand what I mean by that if you've read Poe stuff. It's behind a wall, and it felt like that contradicts, if you've read the story you'll know what I mean, possibly. So I didn't really enjoy that story, to be honest. I felt there was a few contradictions, and the ending just didn't make sense with what came before it, but tempted to go on into detail about why that is, but I'll just leave it for there. There's plenty of other good stories. Speaking of which, I realise I'm looking down quite a lot, just perusing the book. Vengeance of the Elementals, a character called Anton Zarnoki, I believe that's how you pronounce it, who's a fire chief. Really quite interesting story. Again, these are fairly varied, even if they just cover a sort of same type of character every time. This one's a little bit different though. This character's heroic in a way. He's a fire chief. He's obsessed with fire and fire statistics. He maps out where all these incidents happen and occur. And I'll just say, just a little bit more of a spoiler for this one. I'm always interested in statistics, and it takes a sort of pragmatic view again. He finds that if he plots them on the map, like a little connect the dots type thing, the fires themselves on the sort of 2D projection take on the figures of imps and goblins and whatnot, and it's the elementals there. This idea of just elemental fire actually given life and given form as sort of creatures that are actually out to do destructive harm, I suppose. So it's quite interesting, and he does all this different research about them, and he eventually contacts through embers and sort of like dying embers, and he contacts these elementals and speaks with them in a way really quite interesting. Unfortunately, again at the end of this, I was very disappointed because, I'll just say this one. Okay, this one's going to be a bit more spoilery as well. I didn't enjoy the fact that there's a bit of astral projection in the story where it just did not make sense with what happens. Actually, I'll leave it there. I don't want to. Actually, this is one of the better stories. This is just on the fly, sort of figuring out what I'm going to say. There's a bit of astral projection, but it doesn't really make sense with what happens at the end of the story, and it seems to contradict it in a way. And it doesn't have a connection at all with the elementals. I'll say that at least. Good story though, very good build up as with the others, a couple of stories. Good story. In the Compartment, this one is very again driving, very sort of active. It all takes place on a train. This one is a little bit less philosophical. There's this interesting character where Godjemba, I believe that's how you pronounce it, or Godjimba, who is a train fanatic, but in the sense where he, as soon as he gets on a train, he will automatically change character. Again, it's that feeling of the vital force. Of course, you can have the negative elements to trains, but this sort of timid character gets on a train, and the force of that, and the speed and whatnot, he changes character completely. And so this character, he meets two others in this compartment on the train, and I won't give any spoilers for what happens there, but let's just say things get quickly out of hand, and it's quite a gripping narrative there at the end. It's just what I like about this as well is that it's really neat. Some of these elements don't really cohere, and I don't really understand, like the shrinking and so really quite a compact story. What I like about this one is that it's simple, and the way the character ends up really doesn't really make sense with how it starts, and I feel like I completely understood it, and it's a good feeling. It's really neat and simple. So I recommend The Compartment, definitely. I suggest it as one of the better ones in the book. Saturnine Sector. I really enjoyed this one as well. The story's got really good by the end. This one is an interesting one. It's all about time, perceptions of time. There's a character who, again, they're all outside the norm. They're all looking from the inside out, from the outside in. A character who has this idea of unlimited. Again, it's a lot to do in this book with speed and motion. This character feels that for him, time should not exist in the sort of standard sense of divisions of hours, months, years, etc. For him, it's a constant duration, indivisible. And again, this one's a little bit more philosophical and takes a little bit more thought, but it's still good. And he finds out there's this character called SS, who is writing against his ideas. So just standard time, really. He talks about time in these sort of articles, scientific articles in these newspapers, and he gets frustrated by this. He feels that he has the right idea of time, and I can't really say too much more than that. There's a really quite a surreal moment where he's actually met by Saturn, situations with time, and that's why the protagonist meets Saturn, and they have this sort of back and forth about whose idea of time is correct. And so I'll just say I'm sort of struggling to figure out how to encapsulate this story, but I'll just say there's a sense of this protagonist, he might not be who he appears to be, and by the end it's quite poignant because who he actually is, I'll say, really contradicts his own personal idea of time, his philosophical viewpoint of time, and especially because of his profession. And I really want to go into all he talks of Saturn, and there's a watchmaker and whatnot, but I'll leave it there. There's a lot of this is a more intellectual story. It's sort of difficult to encapsulate again, but I really definitely enjoyed that one a lot more. Funnily enough, I read a review that said it's one of the weaker stories. I quite enjoyed it. Guess that's just preference and taste for you. So the last story in this collection is The Glance. The Glance, definitely one of the better ones. The central conceit of this short story is a man loses his partner, who dies. He sees her for the last time walking out a door. Again, this is going to be a very introspective story. It all hinges upon this imagery of this door. Really, it's all about paranoia in a way, this story. I love how it develops, the imagery develops. It's sort of like a layered feeling where so this partner just in the very start of the book dies, and he becomes obsessed with this idea of the door, and it starts off with he is afraid of what could be behind the door in his mind, because he sees the sort of the heel of this woman, this partner, and the last thing he saw of her. So then that then develops into this idea of being afraid of corners and street corners, mystery. He's actually afraid of mystery itself, and then that eventually develops into he's scared to look behind him, and he constantly actually gets extremely paranoid where he says, "I'm going to look behind me now." I felt that was quite poignant, that one. And there's actually, it's funnily enough, there's a scene in this this section in this short story where it's very much, this is for the two people that read my short stories. I wrote a short story called Bright House, Black Dog, and there's a very interesting and poignant part where, in this short story, where the character Odinich, he takes down all of his drapes, he dismantles his cupboards, and he makes his room completely white, and he's scared of mystery itself, and he wants brightness and open space, and he doesn't want anything to jump out at him. And I found that it connects with my own story there. See what I mean? And things become more and more strange. He looks at one thing and sees another thing, and by the end, it's sort of an open-ended story. I wasn't entirely sure how it really concluded, but I think it could be quite smart as well, though, how it ends up. I'll just say he might finally look behind him, but we're not told what he sees. So that's very, very much in the head of this character type story. Yeah, a good one to end on, I think. So it's a long review. Plenty more I could have said about this. Again, some of the short stories do have their flaws, and maybe I always try and give the author the benefit of the doubt on that. But yeah, I definitely recommend The Dark Domain if you're interested in philosophical, metaphysical, introspective, dark fiction. But I'd say what I liked about this actually is I find myself sort of liking Stefan Grabinski and his voice as well. They're not like Thomas Ligotti or Laird Barron, where it's unrelentingly dark. Some of the conversations are actually quite funny in this book, so yeah, it's got that going for it as well. So that was The Dark Domain by Stefan Grabinski. Hope you enjoyed the review, bit of a longer one. Probably George MacDonald next, trying to tackle all of his stuff. It's been a while, but again, thanks for watching. Cheers.